Hi, this is Christinisa Health, and I'm here to talk to you today about a groundbreaking new memo from the NIH that has the potential to put the research enterprise on its head. So late Friday, NIH released a memo that they're going to cap indirect cost at 15%. And I know to many people this sounds like an amazing idea. Why are we subsidizing indirect cost for research? Well, that's a very, very long discussion, but it has the potential to totally disrupt the research enterprise and set the United States back as far as groundbreaking research. So let me go to the beginning to break this down. So NIH is one of the premier funders of research in the United States. There's, of course, pharmaceutical companies that support a lot of research at the universities and other locations, but they primarily focus on getting clinical drugs to the market. So doing phase 1 through phase 4 clinical trials to get those drugs into the hands of the people. Now that's certainly important. You could perhaps say there's somewhat of a bias. There's certainly a bias in the financial aspect that they are going to pay for things that will make them money. So the NIH, whereas, has the potential to support basic research. So basic research is where you might not see a translation into your daily lives. There's kind of this science for science sake, which you may say, well, that's not important. But the thing is, basic science hopefully leads to applied science, leading to translational science. So sometimes you need the researchers doing that very entry-level research, which may or may not have that translation into the world. The thing is, we may not know what the translation into the real world is, so there is the benefit to that basic science, and that is where the NIH comes in, where they're funding that basic science. The NIH is also one of the main negotiators of the indirect cost rates, so they're actually having their people negotiate these indirect cost rates. And it's a several-year process. It takes forever to negotiate these indirect cost rates. And the thing is, they cut a lot of cost out of the rate in the end. So it's a whole negotiation that may take a year or more. And well, first of all, there's already a cap of 25% on administrative cost. And then they just keep cutting costs here or there. So you'll work up this whole proposal, and then by the time you get to the end of it, it's been cut down. So it's definitely cut by the time you get your rate. So you aren't getting all your costs covered. And you say, well, what is indirect cost? Like, I just want my money to fund the research. Well, the thing is, the researcher is not in a vacuum doing his research. It's not just beakers and his time. The thing is, he's supported by the whole university research infrastructure. So there's the whole facilities, there's electricity, there's all of the administrators. And you say, well, I don't need administrators. Like, why can't he just do the research himself? Well, the thing is, researchers are good at research. So they're not good at administration generally. There may be, of course, some researchers that are good at administration, but for the most part, they're researchers, so they don't want to spend their time doing administration. And I have to say the NIH is up there at the front putting burdens on them of different things that they have to take care of administratively. So the NIH is not immune to putting all of those burdens on the professors. And the thing is, they also need people to keep them in check, to make sure they're not spending the money in bad ways, to make sure they're not sending their research to China. You know, there's all of these checks and balances in place to make sure the money is spent appropriately. There's a real cost to that. And see, it's not something that you can directly charge to the research. It's hard to quantify, okay, this administrator helped the PI, but the administrator helped them on everything. Maybe they helped them on their science. Maybe they helped them on scheduling their meetings. Maybe they helped them put a presentation together. Maybe they helped them with their students. So you can't say, well, it's this amount of portion to the grant. So you have all of these indirect costs that are bolstering up the professor, negotiating their contracts even, putting the expenses through on their grants. And so all of these costs come up with this very complicated indirect cost rate that NIH often is the one approving. They're not immune or outside of the process. This rate gets charged across the board to their grants. Now, in the memo that was released, it was cited that sometimes the university accepts lower than their indirect cost rate. And this is true. Sometimes they actually accept higher because the thing is, like I said, the indirect cost rate that is negotiated, the final rate that gets approved, is not all of their indirect costs. So they may actually charge industry the full rate. So maybe their indirect cost rate that's been negotiated with the government is 54%, but then maybe their industry rate is 70%. So the government's actually getting a break sometimes on that research. But they cited, sometimes the professor really wants to apply for instance, a foundation. Foundations are notorious for not giving full indirect cost rates because they feel like their money should go directly to the research, which again, as I've explained, that's somewhat of a fallacy. Foundations are notorious for less than ideal indirect cost rates. And so the professors say, well, I really need to apply this foundation. This is an awesome opportunity for me. And they may have to go through this whole approval process because basically other entities are subsidizing that foundation's research. So it's not like, someone has to take up those costs because there's still all of this university infrastructure that's helping produce that grant. And so the reality is it's taking money away from something else. And so generally institutions will have some sort of approval process to have an exception to their rate. And they also mentioned, well, Harvard can do it. Well, Harvard's private. And yes, they mentioned University of Michigan, although University of Michigan is one of the most prolific research institutions. But the reality is we rely on these indirect costs to keep the whole infrastructure that supports the researcher going. And so this could have disastrous implications for the research enterprise. Now, the way it works is the indirect cost rate is applied to the award after the fact recovery of those indirect costs that have already been paid. So it's likely that this could have a ripple effect years down the road of people being cut and then the researchers, nobody will do my contracts. My contracts take years to negotiate because they're understaffed. Scandals coming out because the money was misused, because the professor didn't have proper oversight. So this could take years of implication. And to be truthful, this whole research enterprise has taken years to come into creation. So the government, yes, is indeed subsidizing the advancement of science. There are some industry support for research, but again, it's directly to things that are going to make them money. They don't generally just support basic research, and you kind of have to have that basic research to get to the applied and the translational research. So if we take away the government funding or the government funding for indirect costs, it's going to eventually have a ripple effect. And you say, well, I just want to privatize research. Well, that's great. But right now, the industry is relying on the universities for those discoveries that they can take to market. So there's not as robust of a research system in industry in place to start making those discoveries to take to market. So they are relying on those university discoveries for their research to go forward. So it would just require a whole restructuring of the way we do research in the United States. It would not be an easy, quick, oh, well, we'll just have industry do it, because industry is relying on the universities to do it. So I just wanted to tell you about this groundbreaking memo that came out. It's turning the research enterprise on its head, as I mentioned, and we will continue to monitor the implications of this memo. Thank you again. This is Christine Needs to Health signing off, and I hope you have a great day.